Burglary, Secrecy, and Politics. The Calamity and Conquest of the Watergate cover-up. On June 17th, 1972, 5 burglars were arrested for breaking into the National Democratic Party office to gather information for the re-election of Republican President Richard Nixon. However, this crime was nothing compared to the tragedy of the cover-up that followed, which is now known as the Watergate scandal. Over the next few years, Nixon and his committees would face many legal battles and publicity problems. America held its breath, waiting to see the outcome, until August 1974, when Nixon resigned in the face of impeachment. This triumph over Nixon's lies is still remembered today, and the presidency will never be viewed the same because of it. When you trace it back to the roots, Nixon's ambitions for life mainly came from the fact that he was the second oldest of 5 sons, fathered by Anthony Nixon and mothered by Hannah Nixon, who worked hard running a small grocery store and gas station. His parents could barely support their growing family based off of their income, so Nixon took into account his parents' struggles and became very ambitious to reach his full potential, so as not to be trapped in a state of displeasure and uneasiness, as he had observed from his parents and his young life. In one of the transcripts that had been recorded at the White House, President Nixon and his associate John Dean talk about how the whole plan to break in was come up with. First, John Dean had told a committee of the presidents that they should come up with a perfectly legitimate campaign intelligence operation, which is basically gathering intel on the opposite side of Nixon's re-election campaign. So, Dean took one of the president's bodyguards, named Jack, and told him to create a plan for getting intel from secretaries and such. This committee, named CREP, which stands for the Committee to Re-elect the President, rejected this plan. However, they still had to do something to get information. So the CREP members hired G. Gordon Liddy, who had worked for the government and White House before, and was very discreet. He was also a lawyer. So he created a master plan that involved bugging, kidnapping, prostitution, and other things of that sort. When Dean, Magruder, Mitchell, and Liddy held a meeting together, they thought that he was very inventive, but that Liddy should revise it a bit. So at the next meeting, when they were still talking about that type of stuff, Dean told them that those topics were not to be discussed in the Attorney General's office, who was Mitchell at the time. After this, Dean thought the matter was closed. However, on June 17, 1972, multiple men were caught breaking into the Democratic National Committee office. This was the second time they had broken into the office. However, on the first, they were not caught. They were somehow connected to Nixon, who tried very hard to cover it up afterwards. In this year, Nixon was running for a second term in office, and the Vietnam War was at its height. The country was divided. Nixon thought it was necessary to bring in a committee to help him get reelected. This is where CREP came in. Some of the members had hired burglars to break into the Democratic National Committee office in May 1972, which was when they first broke in, to place the bugs on the office phones and to steal the documents. However, the bugs were not working properly, which is why they broke in a second time. However, this time they got caught. A security guard on duty noticed that multiple locks on the building's doors were taped over. He called the police, and they got there in the nick of time to catch the burglars. At first, nobody thought of the burglars being connected to Nixon, but some people started thinking about it when a detective found the creep's White House phone number in the burglars' possessions. In August, Nixon gave a speech that got enough of America's trust back to be re-elected by a landslide. The topic of this speech happened to be that none of his staff in the White House could possibly be connected to the break-in, which later findings proved untrue. A couple of days after the break-in, it turns out, Nixon decided to put away large amounts of money as hush money for the burglars. Over the course of the next 2 years, Nixon and his aides went through a lot. First, Nixon and his crew told the CIA to delay the FBI's investigation into the scandal. This is an obstruction of justice, which they would later pay for. 7 people were arrested in relation to the scandal, and at the order of the White House crew, 5 pleaded guilty to avoid trial, while the rest were convicted in January of 1973. At this point in time, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, trial judge John J. Cerisa, and a handful of members from a Senate investigating committee were quite suspicious. Also, some people were cracking under all the pressure put on them by trying to make the cover-up work. Multiple people from the White House testified against Nixon, as well as telling the courts that every single conversation that took place in the Oval Office and the White House had been recorded, although secretly. The prosecutors on Nixon's case tried desperately to take those tapes from Nixon, but he made sure that they stayed in his hands through the summer and fall of 1973. Judge Theresa, the Senate committee, and a prosecutor named Archibald Cox were also trying very hard to prove the president's schemes. Eventually, Nixon decided to fire Cox. In protest, multiple Justice Department officials resigned. This was called the Saturday Night Massacre. Eventually, Nixon gave up and handed some tapes over, though he still kept the majority. In 1974, on March 1st, a new grand jury formally accused 7 of Nixon's former aides on the basis of Watergate. Since the jury was new and they didn't know if they could indict a president, they called him an unindicted co-conspirator. In July of that year, the Supreme Court made Nixon turn over the tapes. The House of Representatives then voted to impeach Nixon on the charges of obstruction of justice, abuse of power, criminal cover-up, and multiple violations of the Constitution. On August 5th, Nixon turned over the tapes. On August 8th, Nixon resigned as President of the United States of America. Vice President Gerald Ford was sworn in, but did not charge Nixon with anything. Therefore, Nixon never did admit that he did anything wrong, criminal speaking.
Today, the world is a lot different than it was in the 1970s. Technology has advanced, the population is growing, but one of the less realized changes in America is the change of the view of the presidency. Throughout the years, the people of the USA have looked back on the Nixon scandal and have actually thought about the length a person would go to obtain information. Therefore, we have also realized that the presidency isn't just about certain political views, but also about high morals and ideals, a kind heart, and an overall considerate, charitable, and compassionate personality. The incident really showed a lot of people that the presidency wasn't just about the opinions, but the person. Without these realizations, our country would not be where it is today.